Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into an incredibly contentious, truly explosive interview that happened recently between Senator Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, this wasn't just, your standard policy discussion. It felt
Yeah,
more like a bare knuckle brawl over the direction of American foreign policy. Some really remarkable moments in there.
absolutely. At one point, you had Senator Cruz accusing Carlson of anti-Semitic undertones.
And Carlson just fires right back,
Right.
asking are you a sleazy feline again? It
Uh,
just, wow, it really showed the personal bitterness under the surface.
it really did. So our mission today is to kind of step back from the sheer drama of it all,
Yeah.
unpack the arguments they were actually making, look at the core ideas, the philosophies underneath, and maybe even deconstruct the political tactics involved.
Exactly. We want to give you a clear, sort of impartial look at what this clash, this really extraordinary clash, reveals about where a big chunk of American foreign policy thinking might be headed.
What's fascinating, I think, is just how quickly it all spiraled. It really tells you something about how raw these debates are right now, especially in conservative foreign policy circles.
Oh, definitely. It's way more than just, a slight difference of opinion. It's fundamental disagreement on what America's national interest even means. How do we define threats? And maybe the biggest question, how should we actually protect ourselves?
Yeah, in this, increasingly messy world. So this deep dive, we hope, will shed some light on those deep fractures, give you the context for why these really influential voices are going at it so hard.
Okay, let's dig in.
All right, so first up, let's set the stage. This was essentially a very public fight over competing ideas of America first. And Senator Cruz, right out of the gate, he didn't pull any punches. He called for regime change in Iran.
Yeah, very direct. He laid out his reasoning, basically saying the Ayatollah literally leads mobs chanting death to America, and arguing quite simply that America is better off with our enemies out of power and our friends in power. It's a pretty stark position.
It really is. But here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Cruz then tries to carve out this unique space for himself within Republican foreign policy. He specifically pushes back against the traditional sort of poles.
Right. He dismisses the interventionists, implicitly linking them to people like John McCain, Lindsey Graham, maybe George W. Bush, saying they've never seen a country they didn't want to invade.
hmm And then on the other side, he distances himself from the isolationists, like Ron Paul or Rand Paul. He thinks they just don't take the threats to America seriously.
So what Cruz is doing here is really trying to define this third way, right? A strategic move he calls the non-interventionist hawk.
A third point on the triangle, as he put it.
Exactly. Trying to bridge these divides that have often seemed, well, impossible to bridge within the GOP. And his core principle, he says, is the central touch point for U.S. foreign policy should be the vital national security interests of the United States.
The key question always being, how does this make America safer? How does this protect Americans? That's his line.
And he tries to ground this historically, right? He brings up Reagan's peace through strength.
Yeah, and he explicitly links it to Trump's first-term foreign policy, too.
The core belief seems to be that the best way to avoid war is being strong. And the flip side, that weakness and isolationism encourages war.
Which allows him to argue for a pretty tough stance on Iran, saying their nuclear capacity is this existential threat that needs to be taken out, potentially even with U.S. help, right? He mentioned specific sites.
Yeah, like Fordo, that bunker deep in a mountain. He makes the point that Israel alone probably can't take that out. It needs specialized bunker buster bombs, the kind the U.S. has. So he's implying a need for significant U.S. military support there.
But crucially, to keep his non-interventionist credentials, he says the ideal regime change in Iran would come from a popular uprising, from within.
Right. Not a U.S. military invasion. He specifically said he has zero desire for the U.S. military to turn Iran into Switzerland. That framing is really key for him politically. It lets him sound tough on enemies without actually advocating for, the kind of big nation-building stuff that's become so unpopular.
He even points to his own past votes as proof, right? He calls the Iraq War a serious mistake.
Yeah, he sees a pattern where interventionists advocate over and over again, there's a bad guy, let's go topple them, but the result ends up being radical Islamic terrorists taking over, or just the cure being worse than the disease, as he put it.
And he brought up Syria under Obama, how he opposed military action there. He challenged John Kerry defending international norms.
Asking, how is it better to have lunatics who hate us in charge, especially if, as he claimed, many of the alternatives were linked to radical Islamists?
His point seems clear. Don't use the military for abstract ideals if the practical result is actually worse for U.S. interests or just makes things more unstable. It's really an attempt to redefine what American military power is for.
But what's so illuminating right from the start is Carlson's reaction. Just immediate, deep skepticism, and you can tell it's coming straight from those past failures, especially Iraq.
Yeah, he's very open about that. He admits he promoted that war back then.
But now sees it as this profound, costly error where the U.S. got drawn into it in a way that nobody anticipated. He talks about the cost, $3 trillion, and even controversially links it to the destruction of Christian Europe through migration afterwards, these huge unintended consequences.
So his big pushback against Cruz is always about the how. How do you actually do regime change?
Exactly. With Iran, he points to Venezuela with Maduro or Cuba since '59. Decades of trying, failing. Why would Iran be different? It's not just a casual question. He wants concrete plans, real justifications, not just slogans like regime change.
And he ties this straight back to his version of America First. He says the single criterion for making decisions is America's national interest. Full stop.
Wow.
Right. Which he sees as synonymous with America First. And you can feel his frustration when he doesn't get those detailed plans, those projections of what happens next. He worries about another Syria, right? An open wound, massive migration, religious minorities get murdered.
Yeah, that weariness with these grand plans that just seem to go wrong is really palpable in Carlson's questioning.
It really is. It reflects a deep fatigue with interventions that, in his view, often end in disaster and actually hurt America in the long run.
And that skepticism, that weariness, it leads right into the next major clash point, doesn't it? This core divide, focusing on problems at home versus threats overseas.
Oh, absolutely. Carlson just keeps hammering this point, trying to pivot away from foreign policy to what he sees as America basically crumbling from within.
He paints these really stark pictures, doesn't he? People lying in the street,
Yeah.
sleeping outside Union Station.
Yeah. Talking about D.C. being a complete craphole, saying he feels like I could get carjacked here. And he lists off other cities, Oakland, Philly, New York, Chicago, L.A.
Basically saying they're all facing this kind of decay and crime.
And his argument is that Congress is just neglecting the country that elected them because they're so focused on other people's problems.
He gets specific, too, pointing to the money.
Right. The dollar spent, the aid packages to Ukraine to pay the retirement of civil servants in a country that we have nothing to do with. And then, even more pointedly, the endless support for Israel, very expensive when people are literally buying groceries on credit in the United States.
It culminates in that really powerful question he asks, what is victory worth if our own country becomes what it is now?
And that line of argument, you have to admit, it connects with a lot of people right now. That feeling of being forgotten, that priorities are wrong, it puts traditional hawks like Cruz on the defensive.
Yeah, it completely reframes national security as something internal first. You can't be strong abroad if you're rotting at home, basically. It's a huge challenge to that old Washington consensus.
A really powerful challenge.
So how does Cruz handle that? He's got these hawkish views, but he can't just ignore the domestic critique.
Well, he tries to navigate it carefully. First, he agrees, maybe a bit strategically, that yes, America absolutely needs to focus emphatically on domestic stuff, prosperity, debt, low taxes.
But then he pushes back.
Right. He says, look, it's also a dangerous world, and leaders have a responsibility to keep America safe from outside threats, too. You can't just ignore that.
And then he does something interesting. He tries to shift the blame for the domestic problems Carlson is talking about.
Exactly. He argues those issues in D.C., for instance, aren't because of too much focus on foreign policy. They're because of local democratic policies and home rule.
He brings up D.C. crime, blaming the mayor and council for not letting police officers arrest bad guys.
And the whole thing with the D.C. schools potentially expelling, 40% of the African-American students over vaccine mandates during COVID lockdowns. He points to every single Democrat voting for that policy.
So he's trying to say, these problems are real, but they're caused by liberalism, by Democrats running things locally, not by us being engaged in the world.
It's a clever deflection politically. It allows him to acknowledge the domestic pain Carlson highlights, but redirect the cause away from foreign policy spending or focus. He pins it on a specific political ideology. Democrat policies don't work, and they destroy every community that they're in charge of.
So he can still argue for a strong foreign policy, saying, you need both. Safety abroad underpins prosperity at home.
Precisely. And this is where you see that deeper philosophical divide emerge again. Remember when Carlson sort of accused him of moral relativism, saying world leaders all kill people?
Oh, yeah. Cruz pushed back hard on that.
Very hard. He talked about America's unique moral foundation, that the whole purpose of America is to protect the God-given rights that each person possesses. It goes back to that idea of American exceptionalism.
So Cruz is trying to walk this line, acknowledge domestic problems, blame Democrats for them, but still insist on the need for American strength and engagement abroad. He's pushing back against the idea that focusing overseas causes problems at home.
It's definitely a tricky balancing act politically, trying to appeal to different parts of the base.
Okay, now let's get to the real flashpoint. I mean, the moment the interview just absolutely ignited the topic, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and this whole incredibly charged issue of foreign influence.
Yeah, Carlson just went straight for it, didn't he? Really direct questions.
Totally. He asks point blank, is AIPAC a foreign lobby? Does it coordinate with the Israeli government?
And then he keeps pushing on why it's not registered under FRA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act.
Right. And FRA, just maybe for clarity for everyone listening, it's that law from way back, 1938, that says if you're acting as an agent representing foreign interests politically, you have to disclose that relationship and what you're doing. It's about transparency.
And Carlson really underscores the seriousness, saying, if you are lobbying on behalf of foreign government, you must register. It's really simple. People have gone to jail for not registering. The implication being, why the exception here?
That line of questioning, it just immediately sends the conversation onto what people call the third rail in American politics, doesn't it? Especially when it's about Israel.
Absolutely. It's so sensitive that just asking certain questions can trigger these incredibly fierce reactions, often, as we saw here, used to kind of shut down the discussion.
And Carlson keeps digging, trying to get at the real cost-benefit of the U.S.-Israel relationship. He asks about the support level.
Cruz gives the standard figure, about $3 billion a year in military aid.
But Carlson wants more than that. He asks about the total annual cost of defending Israel, including cost of the weapons, U.S. personnel there, even moving ships to the region like tankers.
He's pushing for that broader picture, the full operational cost, the strategic commitment, not just the direct aid number.
And he challenges Cruz personally, right? On Cruz saying his driving motive is to be the leading defender of Israel in the United States Senate.
Yeah, basically asking, shouldn't a U.S. lawmaker's job be only about defending the interest of my country, implying a potential conflict?
And then, the really provocative bit, Carlson claims Israel spies on us, including on the president. And he seems genuinely baffled that Cruz seems okay with that.
Just throws it out there.
Yeah.
So faced with all this direct barrage, how does Cruz respond?
Well, it's pretty much textbook political deflection, isn't it? A masterclass in changing the subject under pressure.
Instead of tackling those specific questions about AIPAC's status or AR directly.
He pivots. He turns it right back on Carlson, questioning his motives, accusing him of an obsession with Israel.
And then that really loaded question. Why are the Jews controlling our foreign policy?
Which instantly escalates everything. Carlson immediately fires back about the anti-Semitic undertones, and boom, the conversation explodes.
It's a classic tactic, isn't it? When you're cornered on a sensitive issue, try to discredit the questioner's intent instead of answering the substance.
So Cruz insists AIPAC is an American lobby.
Right. He says it lobbies for the United States and for a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship. He's adamant it's not a foreign lobby and not coordinating with the Israeli government in a way that would trigger FARA.
He used that analogy, right? I hire you, and you lobby on behalf of me. I direct you. Does Israel direct AIPAC? No. That was his argument.
Yeah, framing it as just another American interest group advocating for a policy it believes is good for America.
And the spying claim.
He basically brushes it off, saying every one of our friends spies on us. He even names the Brits and Canadians.
The implication being it's just how the world works, even among allies, so it's not a reason to ditch Israel.
And that accusation of anti-Semitism, that's precisely why this is the third rail. Cruz explicitly says Carlson is conflating the two, the government of Israel versus Jewish people as a whole.
Which is a critical distinction in these debates. Conflating a state's actions with an entire people is often seen as, well, problematic and potentially anti-Semitic, regardless of the speaker's intent.
And it effectively works to halt further critical questions by raising that incredibly charged accusation.
Cruz even tries to downplay AIPAC's power, doesn't he? By bringing up the Iran nuclear deal.
Right. He points out that AIPAC failed to stop that deal under Obama, a deal Cruz himself says he was the leading opponent of.
The argument being, if AIPAC was really all-powerful, surely they would have won that fight. It challenges that perception of overwhelming influence.
Which raises a good question for you, the listener. How do we gauge the real versus perceived influence of these groups? It's tricky.
And Cruz, throughout this, frames his strong defense of Israel not as bowing to foreign influence, but as a pragmatic security choice for America.
Yeah, he argues Israel is fighting our enemies for us, taking out military leaders, trying to stop Iran's nuclear program, and that this makes America much safer.
So supporting Israel is supporting American interests, in his view. He even connects it back to Trump's policies, like needing those U.S. bunker buster bombs for sites like Fordo, aligning it with that non-interventionist hawk approach.
But it's crystal clear that Carlson sees this deep connection, this passionate defense, totally differently, as a fundamental conflict of interest, prioritizing a foreign government over America's own needs.
Yeah, this whole segment just perfectly captures how differently they understand and apply the idea of America first.
Completely different interpretations.
Okay, let's shift gears to another major disagreement, the Ukraine war. Here, too, we see just completely different stories about how it started and what it means.
Totally conflicting narratives. Cruz lays out his case pretty clearly. He starts with Putin's long-term ambition, wanting to reassemble the old Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, something he thinks America should have always taken seriously.
But he zeroes in on a more immediate cause, something he thinks was preventable.
Right. He blames Biden's incredible weakness, specifically the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, arguing it created a vacuum that emboldened Putin.
And then he gets really specific about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Yeah, the pipeline meant to let Russia bypass Ukraine to sell gas to Europe. Cruz takes credit for his sanctions legislation under Trump in 2019, stopping its construction.
But then, he alleges, Biden formally waived the sanctions in May 2021.
Which, Cruz claims, allowed Putin to restart construction days later. Then Cruz says he forced a vote in January 2022 to reimpose those sanctions, getting support from Zelensky in Ukraine and Poland.
But according to Cruz, Biden lobbied Democrats against it. The sanctions failed, and 4 weeks later, Russia invaded.
Leading to Cruz's punchline, if Trump had been president, there would be no war. It's a very specific, almost causal chain he's drawing.
A very stark narrative.
Yeah.
But Carlson, he sees it completely differently.
Oh yeah, entirely different lens. For Carlson, NATO expansion was the trigger. Simple as that. He points to Kamala Harris talking about Ukraine joining NATO just days before the invasion as, like, the final straw.
And he goes even further, right? Saying the U.S. began this war on Russia.
Yeah, by kicking Russia out of SWIFT, that big international payment system, Carlson argues that move, a major economic sanction, actually ended up hurting the U.S. dollar's global standing.
Just to clarify SWIFT for listeners, it's like the main messaging network for international bank transfers. Getting kicked off is a huge economic blow.
Exactly, a massive economic weapon. But Carlson thinks deploying it backfired on the dollar, and he's just generally skeptical about sanctions working at all. He mentions visiting a Russian grocery store recently.
Oh, right, saying it was proof that sanctions against Russia had no material effect on everyday life there.
Which leads him to this really gloomy assessment of the war's outcome so far. He claims Russia is stronger, it's closely allied long-term with China.
While, in his view, Western Europe is weaker and more in debt. And crucially, the United States is weaker and much more in debt.
It just highlights this fundamental difference in how they see the threats, how effective U.S. tools are, and what the real results of these conflicts are.
So what does this split tell us about the bigger picture? It seems to reflect this basic disagreement on whether Russia is still a primary enemy needing major U.S. focus, or if it's secondary now to China, or even just our problems at home.
That seems right. Cruz tries to justify his own votes on Ukraine aid, right? He said he voted for the initial tranche of funding because I wanted Russia to lose. Simple enough.
But then he voted against later aid packages.
Yeah, claiming it wasn't working and the money was being wasted.
Yeah.
And he doubles down on blaming Biden's policies for having drove Russia into the arms of China. Interestingly, Carlson actually seemed to agree on that specific point about the new Russia-China closeness despite their history.
It shows how complex these calculations get in long, expensive wars.
And Carlson keeps pressing Cruz on his past support, doesn't he? Asking if he's questioned any of your previous assumptions, demanding an apology almost. He really doubts the aid to Ukraine was effective.
Yeah, just hammering on whether it achieved anything or just dragged things out. And they even disagree on who blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Right. Carlson flat out says America did that. Highly controversial claim. No proof offered.
Whereas Cruz suggests maybe Ukrainians or Norwegians had a motive, but definitely rules out Russia blowing up its own pipeline. Says it never made any sense.
And this is where the personal bitterness just explodes again. Carlson hits Cruz with that incredibly harsh line.
Oh, yeah. You've been spending the last 3 years telling us that Vladimir Putin is evil and we're going to beat him with other people's children, and 1 million of those kids are now dead.
I mean, just devastating. Accusing Cruz of hypocrisy, of being callous about the human cost, demanding an apology for policies Carlson sees as a disaster. It shows how personal these policy fights have become.
And just when you think it can't get any more intense, the conversation takes this absolutely wild turn. It goes from policy to something that sounds like, I don't know, an intelligence thriller.
You're talking about the Iran claims.
Exactly. Senator Cruz makes this truly shocking assertion. He says Iran is actively trying to murder Donald J. Trump.
And not just Trump. He says they've paid hitmen to do so right here in the U.S., and they're also targeting Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, Brian Hook.
He even adds this detail about Iranian hitmen being arrested at Bolton's apartment. And he presents it as fact, something he was told by the military and intelligence community.
It's an extraordinary claim. State-sponsored assassination plots on U.S. soil against top U.S. figures.
So how does Carlson react to that? It's fascinating.
It really is. He doesn't immediately dismiss it. Instead, he challenges Cruz on the implications. If that's true, he asks, why aren't we already at war?
Yeah, he demands evidence, but more than that, he pushes Cruz on the logical next step. If you really believe this, shouldn't you be demanding immediate military action? Even extreme action?
Exactly. Carlson basically says, if you really believe they're trying to murder our president, we need to strike Iran. Why don't we just nuke Tehran? He actually suggests nuking them.
Wow. So that reveals something critical about Carlson's America First view, right? If there's a direct, confirmed threat to U.S. leaders, his response is immediate, overwhelming force. It's no messing around.
Total contrast to Cruz's non-interventionist hawk stance, which, even hearing this claim, seems to stop short of calling for all-out war. It just perfectly underlines how deep their disagreement goes on using American power and what actually justifies total war.
Okay, so we've gone through this incredibly intense, sometimes really volatile conversation. What are the big takeaways for you listening to this?
Well, first, it's crystal clear they have fundamentally different ideas about what national interest even means.
Yeah. For Carlson, it seems almost entirely focused on domestic problems, homelessness, crime, the economy here. His skepticism about anything overseas comes directly from that. Any dollar spent abroad is questioned if it doesn't help here, now.
Whereas Cruz, while he acknowledges the domestic issues are critical, he defines national interest much more broadly. For him, you have to deal with foreign threats, you have to maintain alliances, because the world is dangerous and that directly impacts safety here.
It really forces you to think, how do you balance those? It's a tough question.
Then there's the whole value of alliances. Carlson is deeply skeptical of the cost, the spying accusations like with Israel, the worry about foreign influence shaping U.S. policy. He sees them as potential drains, distractions.
While Cruz sees alliances, especially Israel, as essential security assets, proxies fighting our enemies, protecting U.S. interests abroad, like stopping Iran's nuclear program. For him, they're force multipliers, not burdens.
Another huge split.
And then the tools. What tools should America use and how? Big disagreements on sanctions, do they work? Do they hope the dollar, like Carlson worries?
And military force. When is it justified? Direct intervention versus supporting proxies. What's the military even for? Is it just, as Cruz says, to kill the bad guys to defend America, or something more, like nation building, which he rejects?
Even moral persuasion comes up, right? Cruz mentioning Reagan, shining truth and light, versus Carlson's skepticism when things are so bad at home.
And through it all, Cruz keeps trying to position his non-interventionist hawk idea as that middle ground strong, but not looking for endless wars, not naive, but not overly eager to intervene either.
So, connecting all these dots, what's the bigger political picture here?
Well, I think it's safe to say this isn't just two guys arguing. It really feels like a battle for the soul of Republican foreign policy.
That deep personal bitterness, the insults like sleazy feline, the antisemitism charge, it shows how high the stakes are, how emotional these splits have become.
And Carlson directly accuses Cruz of basically flipping too far, right? From being maybe more interventionist before Iraq to now, in Carlson's view, overcorrecting and becoming effectively an isolationist, a label Cruz hates.
It highlights how they both use that phrase, America first, but mean almost opposite things by it.
Exactly. For Carlson, America first means fixating on home, extreme skepticism of anything abroad. For Cruz, America first means projecting strength globally to keep America safe and prosperous, using alliances as tools.
Which leaves voters, especially conservative voters, facing this really confusing landscape. You've got this feeling of, as you put it, slowly unfolding tragedy at home versus these constant demands from a dangerous world.
It's a choice between two starkly different visions for where America should go, a real fork in the road.
So as we've heard throughout this deep dive, both Senator Cruz and Tucker Carlson claim their approach prioritizes America's national interest. But it's undeniable after listening to them that their definitions of that interest and the ways they propose to achieve it are worlds apart, causing real friction.
What does this deep split, playing out so publicly between these influential voices, actually mean for America's ability to act effectively, coherently on the world stage?
I mean, maybe more personally for you, listening. As you think about the challenges America faces, where do you draw that line? Between the urgent needs we see right here at home and the constant, often costly demands of a complex and dangerous world.